The message today is rescue. That's the message title, that's the theme. And there's a lot to talk about when we talk about the word rescue. It's in the Bible from beginning to end, from A to Z, Genesis to Revelation. Rescue, 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 rescue. I don't know how many stories is about rescue, but the ones that we can think of just off the top of our heads, it's Moses and the Passover and the Red Sea, and there's Jonah and the whale, and there's Daniel in the lion's den, and you go to the New Testament, there's Peter in the Sea of Galilee, walking towards Jesus, takes his eyes off Jesus, he goes under. There's Peter being rescued from the prison, and the great rescue. You know, as the world continues to spiral down, we keep thinking of the great rescue, don't we? And you know what I mean by the great rescue? That someday we will be able to look up in the sky and we will see Jesus in the clouds of angels. We will be able to say, lo, this is our God. We've waited for him. And on a regular basis, you know what Facebook is. You know, you hear all these stories, or you read all these stories about all these terrible things happening, and it seems very appropriate just to write behind all of them, well, Jesus can't come soon enough. So we're ready for the rescue. At the end of our time together, and I'm going to tell 6 rescue stories, short, very short. But at the end of our time together, we're going to play a song by Lauren Daigle. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. She was on American Idol, and she sings beautifully. But I did a little bit of research. The song is entitled Rescue, and I did a little bit of research. She's a girl that comes from Lake Charles, Louisiana, Christian home, born-again Christian, and something happened to her that just changed her whole life. She was sick during her teenage years and was not in school for 2 years. If you can imagine that, some sort of a virus. She was very, very ill. And from that experience, she was able to write this song, Rescue. And this is a song we're going to play at the end. And these are the powerful words. This is the gist of the words. Is talking about how Jesus rescues us. You were not hidden. You were not hopeless. You were not forgotten. Though you may be in your darkest night, your hardest fight, you may feel defenseless, with your innocence stolen, I will rescue you. And it goes on. There's no distance that I will not cover. I will send an army, and I will be your armor. I will be your shelter. I will rescue you. That is Lauren Daigle, the words of Lauren Daigle's song. We'll be playing that at the end. So let's go to it. 6 quick stories. But before I tell my 6 stories, I've got one little tiny short story. I work at ICC, and stories come in all the time from all over the world about these orphans, these kids in our children's villages. And right now, I don't know if you're aware, of course, all over the world there's tragedies unfolding, but there's this great tragedy in Goma, Congo. There's this gigantic volcano, and there was a huge earthquake, and Goma is a city of 2 million, and many, many buildings fell down, and this volcano just erupted. This is about 40 miles from our little children's village there in the Congo. And so right now, the people of ICC over in Congo are rescuing people from this earthquake, from this volcanic eruption. But anyhow, the first story I'm going to tell goes back quite a few years, and it's about Alcian Fleck. And some of you knew Alcian. She's passed now. But when she was a little girl, she was at camp meeting, and she was about 11 years old. She was a junior. And in the afternoon, it gets hot sometimes in the summer. In the afternoon, they were down swimming in the Clackamas River. I don't know if you've ever swum there. There's a place called the Rocks where a lot of people go swimming. She was really not swimming. She was wading. She was with her cousin Ruth. She was wrestling with her cousin Ruth, as you do, playing around in the water. She lost her balance, and she was swept away into the river. She could not swim. And so she went down once, and came up and cried help. But in the process of coming up, she didn't get quite up to the surface before she cried help. So obviously, water in the lungs, and she goes down again, and she sucks in more water, and she goes down again. And she was trying to cry help. No one could hear her because she was struggling, because she'd breathed in water. But also, right in that area, there's a train. And a train was going by at the exact same time. There was only one person that noticed her. It was a teenager named David Parker. He dove in and rescued her. And long story short, she created ICC. And years later, and of course this changed her life. You know, this a near-death experience would change your life. And years later, as she was called to rescue these little orphans all over the world, she did it in part because she was thinking, hey, I was rescued. My life was saved. I need to save others' lives. But there's a point to this, and this is going to be a point recurring in all these stories. Someone noticed and took action. Someone noticed and took action. The next story that this leads, these stories just lead right into each other. It happened on a date, and maybe some of you know about it because it happened very near here, May 2018. There was a woman named Emily McCauley. She was swimming in the Washougal River, and she got her foot stuck in between some boulders in the Washougal River. And I'm unfamiliar with the area. You probably are familiar with it. It's near milepost 8. There's something called Big Eddy up the. Do you know that? Up the Washougal River, and she's in an inner tube, and she has no life vest on, and she's just floating around in this eddy. But she falls off her inner tube. She's swept down the river. She gets her foot stuck in a boulder, and she's in the water up to here. And the 911 call comes in to the Washougal police, and the call comes in, there's a woman screaming in the river. There's a woman screaming in the river. And there was a Washougal police officer, his name was Francis Reagan, a gentleman, a former SEAL, trained in swiftwater rescue. He got in the patrol car, headed up there. He said he had 7 minutes to figure out exactly what he was going to do. And because he was trained, you know, they know how to do this. They know how to rescue people. He tied diagonal ropes across, and he realized, well, when I get there, I got to take off all my armor, you know, all the stuff that a policeman wears, and I got to put on a vest, and I got to dive in. So he did that. The ropes were strung across, and he was out there trying to get this young woman's foot out from these boulders that it was stuck in. And at the same time, he's trying to keep her head above the water and then trying to dive down and get that foot out. It took 2 hours before he effected that rescue. He was just frozen. She was unconscious. They took her to the hospital unconscious. She was serious at first, then stable. She's well today. Interesting story. Right here. And this is the point, and this is the recurring point. Someone noticed and took action. Who it was, I don't know. But they saw that woman, this woman screaming in the river. They noticed and they took action. Another story, this is the third story, third rescue story. And we're going to the Bible now. So if you have your Bibles, Mark chapter 10, verse 21. Mark chapter 10, verse 21, common, well-known story of the rich young ruler, the wealthy young man. Jesus had already had a big argument with the Pharisees, which always seemed to happen on a regular basis. He'd already found kids to bless. He'd blessed the kids. This happened just before the rich young ruler. He'd found kids to bless. Bring the kids to me. I want to love on them. And then a man, and you can read it there in the scripture, a man comes running up. He's the rich young ruler. He comes running up. He kneels at Jesus' feet, and he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus is beginning to answer him, well, you got to obey God. But in the middle of all that, he says, hey, I have done all that. But then notice a few words here. The word, and they're interesting words. The words say very clearly, Jesus looked on him and loved him. it was something that, like, there's no other place in the scripture. Jesus beheld him and he loved him. You would expect that would break his heart. Well, you may know the story. It did not break his heart. Love, and Harvey talked about kindness, but kindness and love is what the world needs more of. Years ago, there was a man named Hal David, and he wrote the words, it was a song, what the world needs now is love. And, as we look around in the world, and the world is too much with us, it's just coming at us. But as we look around, we still go back to that core principle about love. It was Paul, 1 Corinthians 13, it says there's faith and there's hope and there's love. The greatest of these is love, and love is still the greatest, beyond our imagination, greatest thing. There was a little lady that was a missionary over in India, and she had a lot to say about love. I want to read you some of the things that she said about love. She said, spread love wherever you go. She said, it's not how much you know that matters, it's how much love that you have. She said, if you judge people, you have no time to love. She said, I don't do great things, I do small things with great love. Do you know the lady I'm talking about? Her name is Mother Teresa. She lived in Calcutta, India. And she had all these things to say about love. She said, the issue is not how much you do, but how much love you put into what you do. She said, we can cure physical disease with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, depression, and hopelessness is love. She said, and these are somber words, at the hour of our death, when we come face to face with God, we will be judged not by what we've done, but how we've loved. She said, go out into the world and love the people you meet. And finally, she said, I'm just a pencil in the hand of a writing God who is writing a love letter to the world. Paul said, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love, and that's what we need to be doing today, which leads us to the next story is, we say, well, how do we do that? How do we love? It's easy to love the people that are easy to love, right? But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about loving the people that are hard to love. And in your minds, you can think, I'm sure you can, I can think of a dozen people, but of people that I know that are close and around me that are not so easy to love. Well, how do we love the people that are hard to love? There's another text in Mark, if you'll take and just turn a little bit further in your Bible, a little bit further back. Mark chapter 1, verse 41. Something happens. It kind of gives us the mechanics of how Jesus loved. Mark chapter 1, verse 41. Jesus has already been baptized. He's already called the disciples. The disciples were there at the Sea of Galilee, and he says, I will make you fishers of men. He's already healed Peter's mother-in-law, and almost, not quite, but a similar thing happens. A man comes up to him and kneels at his feet. That's like the rich young ruler. He ran up to Jesus, knelt at his feet. This man comes up to Jesus and he kneels at his feet, only he is a leper. He is a leper. And of course, we don't have Hansen's disease like they had back then, but it's really gruesome. It's really horrible. Hair matted, dressed in rags, and decaying flesh. It's just horrible. And so it says in Mark chapter 1, verse 41, he comes up to Jesus and he says, I want to be healed. And you can read this in various different amplified versions, but the gist of it is he says, I want to be healed. And Jesus says, well, I want to heal you. And he does eventually heal them. But in the process, it says, Jesus was moved with pity. You see it there? And some versions say compassion. Jesus was moved with pity. Jesus was moved with compassion. And It's an interesting word study. The word is splagnitsomai. I'm not a Greek scholar, but I can read books about it. Splagnitsomai, and it's where we get the word spleen. The root word is splag, and we get the word spleen from there. And what the writer of Mark was trying to convey was Jesus was moved to the very core of his being. Doctor, where is the spleen? Here, over here? Right side?
Left side.
Left side. Okay, yeah, I see that. Left side. So the core of his being. So the writer of Mark is saying Jesus was moved to the very core of his being. He was moved in his guts. And you know, he was having a visceral type of reaction to this man. And we can understand that, can't we? Because all of us have been through grief situations, loss situations, surprise, terror situations where we feel it physically. This is what the writer of the Bible was trying to get across, that Jesus felt this. We have that term, heartache. Have you had that? Just heartaches, like a physical thing that's going on. That was what the writer of Mark was saying about what was going on here. Jesus was moved with compassion. And that brings us to the next story. We're moving away from the Bible to more stories. And this story is about something that happened on April 15, 2019. And it happened to a young lady. And I want to tell you about this young lady in just a second. Dennis is going to put some photos on the screen. This young lady, her name is Judith. She grew up over in the Congo, orphan. And she grew up at our children's village, the ICC Children's Village. That's where she grew up. I don't really know her past, but there's a phrase around ICC that none of our children have a good past. You know, these kids come to the children's village, and in a lot of ways, they're hugely traumatized. And you know, at these children's villages, all of them have counselors. And these kids have PTSD, and they've gone through horrible things. Like the kids, just recently we got that their parents were murdered, and the rebels were out poking around the jungle trying to kill them, and the kids were running away. That happens. And so Judith was one of these type of children. She came to the children's village as a little girl, and she grew up. So I don't know how long ago she came there, but in 2018, she was 20 years old. She'd come, she'd received medicine and clothes and education. She had a career, and she moved out to this town called Goma, right where the volcano is now. So she's out there, she's a secretary, she's making not a fortune, but she's got her own place. And then something happens, and it happened on April 15, 2019. And let's show the picture, the first picture. Where this is in Africa, and you can go home and look up at a map or something. Between the Congo and Rwanda, there's this gigantic lake, and this lake is called Lake Kivu, K-I-V-U. And in the midst of this, and the lake's like 60 miles long, in the midst of this lake, there's an island called Ijwi, I-D-J-W-I, Ijwi Island. That's where the children's village is. But people are all the time getting in boats. A lot of times they're fleeing disasters. A lot of times they're fleeing war. They get in boats. The boats are overloaded with cargo. The boats are overcrowded. And the winds come up and the waves come up and the boats capsize. And just, I don't want you to have nightmares over this, but this is not the exact boat, but it's exactly what happened. So you can see people on the top, they're jumping over. You know, you don't want to be sucked in when the boat goes down. You can see people on the bottom, and there's people out just swimming as hard. They're doing the crawl, swimming as hard as they can to get away. And the tragedy is, you can show the next picture. The tragedy is that there's people that were down below decks. And in the capsize that we're talking about, and I'll get back to Judith in a second, and they capsized. 150 people were lost, and very few people were saved. And so Judith is there in Goma, and she's walking back and forth to work, and she's seeing the rescue efforts. They're going out, pulling the saved in. They're bringing the bodies in of the people they can find, and of course she's heartbroken. She's grown up with Christian values, and she feels what Jesus felt. She feels compassion. She's a young lady with a huge spiritual direction in her life, and so she feels this, and she's watching all of this. And as she's walking, going back to and from her work, she walks through the marketplace, and she sees a little boy. And this little boy is 4 years old. She sees him 1 day, and 2 days, and 3 days, and finally on the 4th day, she stops, and she talks to the little boy. What's going on? And this is what he says. He was in the boat with his mom, with his dad, with his grandma. Somehow he got out. He was saved. He was brought to shore. They were not. They were lost. And somehow in the confusion, he just fell through the cracks. So here's this little 4-year-old boy, and he's just, what do you do? He's in the marketplace. And he's getting food, and he's sleeping under cardboard for these nights. And so she takes him home and cleans him up. And she doesn't have a whole lot of money. She does the thing that she believes is the wisest. She takes him to the children's village on Ijwi Island in Lake Kivu. And he's here. He's there to this day. And I think we got a picture. That's Judith. His name is Daniel. That's Daniel. And the point is someone noticed and took action. Judith noticed and took action. And that's the recurring point. And she did it because when she was there in the children's village, they always teach one central lesson. And the central lesson is that because of love, you can go out and change the world. You can go out and change the world. And she had this massive compassion. And so everyone else was wandering around. Everyone else was in that marketplace. But it was a young girl who had a massive spiritual direction that noticed and took action. I'm ready for the 6th story. Are you ready for the 6th story? Do we have time? Oh, we got time. This involves my mother and a rescue. And it involves a lady that came into my mother's life that noticed and took action. I hope you're seeing a theme here. Noticing and taking action. It involves a lady that came into my mother's life who noticed and took action. And the story about my mother is that her dad, my grandfather, her dad passed away when my mom was 3 months old. So this is a ways back. And so my grandmother wound up raising my mom as a single mom in dire poverty. I've been to where my mother grew up, and I've been on the outside of the tiny little house. And I mean, the house is like a quarter of what we have here. Tiny, 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 like a bed. There was no indoor plumbing, no water coming in. There was a path, if you know what I mean by a path. There was a path, and that's how my mother grew up. And they were impoverished, very poor. They scraped, and my mother went to public school. They scraped together enough money when my mother was in 9th grade for her to go to academy. But the money ran out. And the day came when someone from the academy said, "You'll have to go home." And when that happened, my mother became a wild child. She just was so angry and filled with bitterness and filled with hurt that this happened to her. She just was out of control. My grandmother tried to do the best that she could with my mom. One thing, and I don't know if this is good or bad, but I think it was good, she forced my mom to go to church. And when she came to church as this teenager that was filled with bitterness and anger, there was a woman that took notice of her and took action. Her name was Mrs. McDonald. And I would love to find Mrs. McDonald or Mrs. McDonald's grandchildren by this time. But Mrs. McDonald loved on my mom. And Mrs. McDonald was the only bright spot in my mother's life. She would, when it came to church, they would love on her and they would meet elsewhere at other times during the week. But a tragedy happened. And that was that the McDonald family moved away. The McDonald family moved away, leaving my mother just a mess. And she stayed a mess until one day, and the McDonald family moved to a place called Madison, Tennessee. I don't know if you've ever heard of Madison, Tennessee, but that's where they moved to. And my mom was just struggling until one day they received a letter from Mrs. McDonald. And Mrs. McDonald in this letter said, "Last night I had a dream, and in the dream I was standing on the side of a river, and as I was looking, and it was fast. It was going fast, and I was looking at this river. There were teenagers that were going down the river, and I ran to the side of the river, and I tried to get one, and I couldn't. And I tried to get another, and I couldn't. And I tried to get a third, and I got her by the hair and pulled her out. And when I saw her face, it was you." Powerful story. And I have my mother's handwriting of this story. Mrs. McDonald noticed and took action. And the long story short was my grandmother said, "This is a sign." And in the letter, Mrs. McDonald said, "This is a sign." And my mother said, "This is a sign." And so they moved to Madison, and my mom had a religious experience, a conversion, and her life changed forever because this one woman wrote a letter. She noticed and she took action. I want to end with some quotes, and we'll watch another story, short story, and then we'll watch Lauren Daigle. Grace Grogan, whoever she is. Grace, she wrote something on the internet and I copied it. Grace Grogan wrote, "All around us there are people who are in need of rescuing because sometimes the strongest hands lose their grip, because sometimes the greatest minds get cloudy, because sometimes the biggest hearts break." That's what Grace Grogan said. A gentleman named Damien Barr said something similar. He said, "We're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boats." He said, "Some people are in yachts. Some people are in super yachts." He said, "Some people are in rowboats. Some people are in canoes. And there are some that have no life vests on, that are out in the wind and the waves, and they're going down for the third time." That's what Damien Barr said. Leo Buscaglia, and I've heard of him. He was a clinician, PhD in psychology, years ago. This is what Leo said. He said, "Too often we underestimate the power of a touch, a smile, a kind word. Too often we underestimate the power of a listening ear, an honest compliment, or the smallest act of caring." And then he said, all of which have the potential for turning a life around. And I think, that's my mom. And there's another author, and I'll share this quote. This author, you have read this author many times. You're very acquainted with this author, Anonymous. You know that author? Anonymous. Anonymous wrote, "When you see someone falling behind, When you see someone falling behind, walk beside them. When you see someone that's ignored, include them. Always remind people of their worth. One small act could mean the world to them. And when you think of these quotations, they resonate with us all because we say, yeah, that's what we want to do. We are the ones that need to notice and take action. But we can't rescue. I'm looking out at you, and maybe some of you are really good swimmers. But we can't rescue like the teenager that rescued Alcyon Fleck. And probably we cannot rescue like Francis Reagan. Francis Reagan was the police officer that rescued the woman from Washougal River. We can't do that. We don't know how to do that. But we can love people. We can love people. You know, we think of the world and all that's going on, which is just like it's coming at us much too fast. But we think of the pandemic, and I was mentioning to my wife this morning, I have, and I don't know if you have, but I've lost numerous friends to the pandemic. And I'm thinking of an acquaintance, a friend, that we used to work at Newbury Park Academy. And this gentleman was a PE teacher at Newbury Park Academy. He spent his whole life as a PE teacher in Seventh-day Adventist schools. His name is Steve Wilson. I don't know if anyone has ever heard of Steve. But he's a guy that's probably 63, 4, but one of these guys that has not done anything other than keep track of his body all throughout his life, and he's now just fighting for his life. And his wife is just, you know, it's up and down, and I said to Charmin, I think he's been in the hospital 3 months, and it's just been a horrible battle. So the pandemic. And I think of the fires. You know, here we are, we live in this beautiful place, but yet we know what can happen. And I have friends, loved ones, that have lost everything they've owned to the fires. So we think of the world, and you add on to that the economy and the crime and all the struggles throughout the world, and it's a pretty upset place. And you think about personal lives, people all around us that are struggling with family, with jobs, with sickness and this and that, and we can't rescue them, but we can love them. And all those things that Mother Teresa said, we can do all of that. We can. We have to do it with compassion. And we got to feel it like Jesus felt it. And I don't know if we can, but we've got to pray, Lord, give me compassion that I don't have. And help me feel it splagnitsomai, in the spleen, in the core of our being, in our guts. Just give us a heartache for people that are struggling. Give us that. And I think one of the things is we think about our lives, boiling it all down, we just want someone to come close to us. And I told you I want to share a story from my childhood. Are you up for a story from my childhood? When I was a kid, I was bad. Now, Dennis knew me when I was 17. I was pretty good by 17. But there came a time, my parents struggled with me. And I think they began just the day I was born. But it was time for me to go to kindergarten. I wasn't going to go to kindergarten, and I was having, they didn't use those words back then, but they use them now, meltdown. Do you know what that is? Meltdown. So I was melting down. I'm not going. And my parents, my mother was just driven to distraction, and she finally got me to, it was a public school, Monte Vista School, down in Claremont, California. She finally, in the late morning, she got me to the school, and I'm standing there at the doorway, and I'm not going. I'm still having my meltdown. And back in the day, and I don't know if they do this now, but the kindergartners had little rugs. Is this just something foreign? Have you heard of this? Kindergartners have little rugs, and they get tired during the morning time, and they all throw out their rugs on the floor, and they take a little nap. So is that common up here? Okay, so is this okay. So anyhow, so all the kids, I'm there in the doorway having this meltdown, and all the kids are there resting, and across the way, I see Margaret Keys. And Margaret Keys was a friend of mine, a little girl that lived down the block, and we played together all the time. And she lifts her little head up and she says, "He can come over here. He can come over here." And guess what? I went over there, and just one little thing. She noticed her little neighbor having a meltdown, and she took action. "Hey, come over here." I want to end with just the end of that story about the rich young ruler. If you're up on your Bible, you know the rich young ruler did not accept Jesus. Jesus looked on him and he loved him. He loved him. And Jesus was all set to have a wonderful relationship with that young man, but he turned and went away. As we watch Lauren Daigle, again, you've probably committed yourself to Jesus in the past, but as you watch this, and we'll end with this will be our benediction this morning. As you watch, think about how Jesus knows who you are. You are not hidden. What does the word say? You are not hopeless. You are not forgotten. Think about how he comes to you in your darkest night. Think about how when you're in your hardest fight, when you feel defenseless, when you feel your innocency has been stolen, think about how he will rescue you. And the fact is, there's no distance that he will not cover. He will send an army. He will be our armor. He will be our shelter. He will rescue us. We're going to play the video. That's the conclusion of our worship today.
You are not hidden. There's never been a moment you were forgotten. You are not hopeless. Though you have been broken, your innocence stolen, I hear you whisper underneath your I hear your SOS, your SOS. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true, I will rescue you. There is no distance that cannot be covered over and over. You're not defenseless. I'll be your shelter, I'll be your armor. I hear you whisper underneath your breath. I hear your SOS, your SOS. I will send out an army to find you in the middle of the darkest night. It's true, I will rescue you. I will never stop marching to reach you in the middle of the hardest fight. It's true, I will rescue you. I hear the whisper underneath your breath. I hear you whisper you have nothing